Hello, I am the Awkward GM Corbin, and today I have a lovely guest, Eddy Webb. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Eddy Webb. My pronouns are he, him. I am one of the in-house developers at Onyx Path Publishing, as well as the executive producer. I am the creator and owner of the Realms of Pugmire, and I manage a bunch of other shit. And I still freelance for other companies on top of all that because I don't know when to stop. I just keep working.
Yeah, and right now you've got the Storypath Ultra Core Manual Kickstarter going on as
Yeah,
of recording.
it's a backer kit, but yes.
Oh, backer kit, yeah. It's always the crowdfunding campaigns can sometimes
No,
confuse me.
totally.
There's so
Like,
many.
but that's something internally we've had to work on for a while now. Is because we're so Kickstarter was the first one, and so it's
Yeah.
become kind of like the Kleenex or the Xerox, where
Mhm.
it's like I mean crowdfunder, but I had to train myself and everybody else to go. No, we have to say crowdfunding campaign because now we're using different platforms and whatnot.
I getcha. I need to learn that myself as well. So with that being said, though, it's currently hit 35,000 on the crowdfunding campain.
That's awesome.
Congratulations!
Thank you.
I This was supposed to be a smaller project, if
Yeah.
the right. Can you
I mean,
speak to that?
it's. I mean, we went with a slightly lower target, obviously. But still, yeah. I mean, it was the okay. This would be a neat little one to kind of just. It still needs to be crowdfunded. Still good to get it out there. But like with all the hype leading up to Curseborne, it's like it would be fine if this one was just kind of okay. And it was hilarious because on the Discord, at least one person was like, "I'm not even sure it's going to fund," and then the next day it was like 300% funded or whatever, and it's just like I think we're fine. But it has been just really wild to see how many people are really excited about this thing because it's something that Onyx Path has never really done before.
That's awesome. Yeah, a generic Storypath Ultra, we'll get into it, but a generic
Yeah,
system is without like a setting attached to it is very hot right now, I feel. In any
yeah.
in any case, about this specific product though, like, so who's your intended target audience for this book, for Storypath Ultra Core Manual?
I mean, honestly, it is for people who like working with their own system. So like everyone's gonna be a bit of a hacker, and I think that's true of anybody who uses a system with no setting attached to it. Whether they're using
Mhm.
Cortex or Fate or what have you. These are generally people who are gonna be like, I have an idea for a game. I don't want to, or I don't feel comfortable making up my own game system. So naturally, it's going to be towards people who want to get into the guts of things and fudge around. Um, but I did write this so that way people who are interested in design but don't want to become game designers just to run a game can use it.
Mhm.
And I think that was kind of the big point of it because there are a lot of generic universal role-playing system, for example, kind of the first big kind of
Oh yeah.
universal system like this, kind of just gave you the rules and said, "Here you go." And it took a while before certain kind of this is how you approach it and our logic behind it came about. And I still think a fair number of these don't always go into the whys. A counterexample, Fate does a really good job of explaining here's the logic of our design. Um, and so that's something that definitely wanted to give to people, particularly story guides, is to say, okay, when we have these rules down, here's our logic behind it. Here's why we made these decisions the way we did. So that way, when you're putting at your table, you can make the choice of whether you want to go with this or not, but understand why you're making that change in the rules. Why are you going a different direction? And whether again, like if that's what's great for your table, we're not here to stop you, but understanding, well, this is why we made the decisions we did, and being a little more transparent about that, I think is very new.
Oh yeah, it's definitely a lot better to see that sort of information. Like, there are probably a lot of questions people have in regards to why a mechanical decision was being made initially, why it seems like some abilities only go to certain levels.
hmm
So would you say this book is giving a lot to game masters then?
I think by the nature of what it is, it's going to be a bit, kind of game master forward. Um, I think players can still get value out of it, right?
Yeah.
Because knowing why you're making decisions when you make your character and kind of decisions of how the dice work are certainly valuable for certain kinds of players. There's
Mhm.
definitely players who just like, I just want to fill in dots on my sheet and roll dice and tell me what happens, and that's fine. Storypath Ultra works for you too, but you're probably going to read the core rules, character creation, and pretty much be done.
Yeah.
And that's okay. But there are certainly people who are like, okay, so why does this number matter versus that number? When I'm making my character, it doesn't necessarily have to want my character optimized, but you want to know the impact of your design choices or your character creation choices. And so I think even players would get some value out of something like this.
Yeah. So would players be getting something akin to, say, like abilities that are in this core manual as opposed to, say, something like At the Gates or The World Below or Curseborne?
Well, I mean, they won't get abilities that are. Well, let me step back. I mean, yes, there's going to be some mechanics that were shown that aren't in any other games, just because we're trying to be illustrative, right? To
Hmm.
show this is how edges work, for example, is how powers work. But for the first half of the book, it's just the rules, right? Because again, it's supposed to be a toolkit that you build with.
Hmm.
I do have an example setting in the back, and we're going to be writing 2 more. And the example setting is a thin but complete example of rules. So if you're making a character using an example setting, or in the other example settings, hopefully,
Yeah.
you have there to make a full character, so you don't have to make anything just to play.
Hmm.
But also because it's not a full game, there's going to be lots of room for guides, even players, to expand, and then you can use the rest of the book to say, okay, well, these are cool powers, but I really want a power that does X. Okay, let's look to the power creation section, figure out a power that can do X to your satisfaction, and then we can add this to this game.
Okay. Gotcha. And so do I need this core manual for games like The World Below, At the Gates, or Curseborne? Like, is it something that I need to have? Like, is
No,
it like,
yeah, it's not like the Trinity Continuum Core Rulebook. It's not like the Chronicles Darkness Blue Book, if you will.
yeah.
This is basically we're taking those rules out of those games and making them a little more standard, because that was one of the design goals when we went to Storypath Ultra. Was when we did Storypath initially, there was a lot of, well, I need to adjust this for this game and that for that game, and what ended up happening was that the rules were not cohesive.
Hmm.
Each game was making bespoke design decisions, which worked fine for that game. Each game runs just fine, but it meant that each one's a little bit different in unfun ways. Each game will be different for obvious ways, but core things were also getting adjusted and tweaked, or just didn't quite work the same way. And so if we were doing that anyway, of like saying, okay, so At the Gates, World Below, Curseborne, Steam Wars, they're all working, singing from the same hymn sheet, if you will. They're all kind of working from the same core infrastructure. Then it's, I don't want to say trivial because it was a lot of hard work, but making a book like this where we're presenting that infrastructure more readily
Hmm.
becomes much more viable that way. So I mean, but we don't want to ever say, okay, to play the game you bought, you also have to buy an additional book that you only want to use to play that game.
Yeah.
Um, uh, there's like with Trinity Continuum Core Rulebook, for example, there is a setting with that book, so you can play just Trinity. And lots of people actually have genuinely really enjoyed Trinity Continuum Core Rulebook and have fun with just that. So that's technically a rulebook you need for other Trinity Continuum games, but it's also a game in itself. Trinity Continuum, the Storypath Ultra Core Manual is not a designed in the same way. It has games in it, but it is not a complete game in and of itself. And so we're going to continue to make sure that each of those games are going to have Ultra in it. But if you have the core manual, you'll be able to see, oh, I see kind of why Matthew made a decision on The World Below. I could see why Daniel made a decision on At the Gates. So you kind of see a bit better about how those games put together, if that's something you're interested in. But no, we're not going to require it as a purchase.
Yeah. Talking specifically about the, like, back of the book example settings that you're putting
Mhm.
into Storypath Ultra, it does seem like a little bit of like a sandbox for you guys to test out new ideas and things like that. Is there anything about like the settings that you really want to like try and differentiate from each other to like sort of explore different areas of Storypath Ultra?
Kind of like the so the first setting, which I wrote, was actually something I pitched to Rich specifically as I want to make kind of a very small game, because a lot of our games are, 250 page books, and those are fine. We do those really well, and I'm happy to keep making those. But I had kind of gotten itched to do something smaller, and so I was like, I don't know, you're never gonna do a 200 page book of wrestling demons in the year 2000 where the apocalypse actually happened, right?
Yeah.
And Rich was like, you're right, I'm not gonna make that. But I came back and I was like, this actually makes it a good way to kind of illustrate, here's a slightly bonkers game, but it shows, okay, so how does this concept work in Storypath Ultra? And then I turn around and show you how it works. With that, I was like, okay, so we're gonna want to do 2 more settings to go in the book. And I was like, okay, we don't need to write those right off the bat. And so it was an opportunity for us to let people vote on it. And so I was like, well, right now we're doing a sci-fi setting, and one more we haven't announced yet, but I think everyone's kind of deduced it's probably going to be fantasy.
Yeah.
So
That's what I was thinking. That was what I was thinking of.
Right. It's a modern day with superpowers one, a sci-fi one. What's the other big genre in tabletop role-playing games? Obviously, Westerns, right? No.
With the poll though, you can just sort of be like explore different elements. Like you have the sci-fi setting, and just to speak to that, you have the superhero setting, and then you have 2 drastically different space opera type settings from what I gather from the description. They're very short, so I can't really tell.
Right, and that was kind of the point, right? Was because the main goal was obviously we didn't want it to be something that we were either had done or planning to do in Trinity for the sci-fi one, or something that we are planning to do or look at doing for, say, Earthbane or Scarlands for the fantasy one. And so I was like, I got a couple of really short pitches, and I specifically didn't write more than a couple sentences. But I was like, here's just the super core idea. Because my ultimate goal with those settings is going to be, let me show you different aspects of how the game can change based on these different types. Because as the overall goal is that one setting to see how Storypath Ultra works one way. Here's 2 different ways you can also spin it. They're also going to be cool, fun, complete games because we want to make sure there's dual utility there. But from a design perspective, it's additionally offering, oh, I see how Advantage, for example, works in this one and this one and this one. I can see how they're all working slightly differently, but even though it's the same core mechanic, here's how, bonds, whatever. So I didn't want to go too far into each of those settings at an early stage because, for example, let's just say that I wanted to show how Advantage works in terms of power and durability with giant monsters or robots. And if I had a sci-fi one with giant robots and a fantasy one with giant monsters, and they both got selected, then I have to do 2 settings of giant creatures, and that's not showing the diversity that I want through as a book design.
Yeah.
So by having people highlight the deciding what pitches they want, basically, it's because it's very similar to how we would do it internally. Right? Here's a pitch for an idea we want to do, and then I can take those 2 pitches and go, okay, here's the kind of commonalities of them, so I can kind of nudge this one in a certain direction, this one in the other direction. It's like, let's say we pick the corporate-owned investigators who are cybernetically enhanced humans who go take corporate-owned ships to explore the galaxy. Then I could look into things like how do organizations work, how do bonds work in relationship to that, how does cybernetics work. There's certain things that kind of come inherent with that. And if that's not stepping on the toes of whatever gets greenlit for the 3rd pitch, then that's great. So yeah, I mean, that's all a lot of the design ethos behind it, but that's also why it had to be very specific. I even had web writers that kind of pitch a setting for that book, and it's like, I kind of, normally yes, but I can't actually do that because I really need to know. I have a certain mental checklist of things that I kind of need to have these things illustrate. And if your thing doesn't do that, it doesn't mean it's not a good setting. It just means that it's not doing the fundamental thing you need the book to do.
I get you. Now, in regards to the Storypath Ultra Core itself, like, what would you say makes Storypath Ultra as a game system stand out from the other game systems that are out there currently on the market?
I think it is a good balance of different styles of play. I want to state upfront, I don't like these labels, but I'm using them because they're commonly understood. And this is a balance of traditional and indie style of play. I prefer to label as it is a system that allows you a certain amount of interesting mechanical depth that if you like that, but also a lot of player control and agency that allows them to shift and adjust the narrative based on what they want to see out of the game. And Storypath Ultra, I feel, is maybe not unique among that, but certainly is a very good job of being very open and clear about what it wants to do with that. And so, for example, just little things like the enhancement and complications and tricks engine means that making a dice roll is not just simple of you have succeeded or you have failed. Like you get a lot of information from that, and players get a lot of options from that. It can just be that if you just want to be like, listen, I just need to know if I get through this door or not. You can absolutely run Storypath that way, and there's zero in the way of getting in the way of doing that. But it's I want to get through this door, and okay, but now it's alarmed, and there might be guards coming, and I decide I want to set the alarm off because it's more important for me to get past the door without the guards seeing me or whatever. Those are all interesting choices that in other games would require additional dice rolls or expenditure of some kind of meta currency or whatever. And in our game, it's all just completely contained within that roll. And over time, we have found that by continuing to just build off of that engine in new and interesting and different ways, we could do a whole lot of different kind of gaming experiences without changing that fundamental engine. And that's really, really exciting.
That's awesome. One thing I have to say from what I've seen of Storypath Ultra is just how modular you've made the game, especially with, we haven't seen it yet in the manuscript, but like, I think the preview for a few chapters, it's like the building blocks section, if I remember, and that's just something as a sort of hobbyist game designer, but also as a game master, I really like to see is ways of adjusting and like picking and choosing and swapping out core things about this system.
Yeah, because the core, the design idea of it, and you'll see as the campaign goes along, is that there are obviously the core rules, and these are the rules that are more or less stable. Just about any Storypath game is going to have something that is extremely similar, not identical to that set of rules. And then you can expand on those rules in different ways. You can make combat more nuanced if you like. You can have larger scale approaches to things. You can make bonds more dense and interesting, whatever. And then on top of that, there are going to be systems that you need to kind of just drop in that not every game needs. And so not every game needs a crafting system. Not every game needs superpowers, and so on. Not every game needs edges. And even if the answer is, well, 90% of games need that, yes, but not absolutely every game does. So we can make that into a building block that you can pop in and pop out as you need. And I think that's really important. Every game is going to have a path in it. So we have paths in that expansion section. But not every game is going to have superpowers. So superpowers, I'm going to pop a superpower system in. And now that it's popped in, I can then adjust it and tweak it if I need to do exactly what I need it to do.
I love it. I just want to say I love everything I see about this system. Just to put my fan cap on for a second.
I appreciate that. It's good to know.
And then, so going a little bit into what other fans might be questioning in regards to sort of the design philosophy, there is a sort of group of people who've played previous Storypath without the Ultra games where they use a lot of abilities, like enhancement stacking was a big thing for some, like Trinity Continuum, Aberrant, and stuff like that. So with Storypath Ultra, what was the decision with capping the certain scores, like enhancement can only go up to 5 and complications 3 and stuff of that nature?
So the main goal of that was the fact, like I actually could point out, like Scion does a lot of enhancement stacking, Aberrant does a lot of enhancement stacking, but because there was no inherent cap, also people who weren't that kind of super powerful were also able to stack enhancements, right? And so, and the other thing is also there became a kind of power creep. It's like I ran a game of just Trinity straight out of the box for some people, and they were very naturally, without trying at all, coming up with 3, 4, 5 enhancements just for relatively mundane tasks, to the point where if you didn't have any, like if you had 0 enhancement on the roll, it's like, oh my god, I'm doing this at a huge penalty, and that's not what that field should be.
Yeah.
So, and one of the things that which Ultra is very specific is that just because it's in the core rules doesn't mean you can't build exceptions, but it has to be a clear exception. You have a clear rule and then a clear exception rather than just kind of muddy, well, I guess it just stacks. And so being able to do things like you can only choose one source for enhancements. That source for enhancement will go +3. If enhancement stacks, maximum is +5. That means that we can say things like advantage gives +2 enhancement, but that advantage ignores all of those limitations. Oh, okay. So superpowers, which will rely heavily on advantage, can then start to break those rules very specifically and intentionally.
Oh, okay.
And so, and then reverse of that also is that by limiting these limitations down further, the dice rolling also takes center stage. It's the other problem we noticed with Core Storypath is that the dice roll is really secondary to the actual resolution of the task. It's basically I'm really just wanting to see if I get a success, so everything else kicks into place. So by reducing those caps, assuming you're not playing a super powerful game, the actual dice rolls matter a bit more. So there's also little things that people haven't commented on, like the fact that we got rid of how you get hits now. You don't roll 10s again because A, it was just taking a bit longer than needed, but also B, there's potential for getting 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 if you keep exploding. Also, only 9s give you special double 9 gives you a chance of 2 hits out of 9. We don't have 8s or 7s doubles anymore. It's all around the hit economy to make sure the hit economy is being more useful, and the dice rolls are not just an afterthought to the core game experience. Again, keep saying this, but I think it's important to really reiterate. You can always make exceptions. In a super powered game, of course, if you're doing a car chase, if you're chasing after a car, if you're immortal, that's going to be you have to roll really well just to try to catch up to that car, and that's an important roll. If you're a speedster, you're really just making sure you don't trip over your feet. That's okay, but it shouldn't be in every game.
No.
Well, I'm just rolling dice just for the hell of it.
I see that point a lot. Like hearing you talk about it, I'm just imagining that for something like, say, Aberrant or maybe Demigod versus like heroes, you would have more like an ability that might say something along the lines of, I guess it wouldn't be a core ability, it might just be a part of the abilities you have as those powerful entities, just being like, these all stack because they're advantage or something like that. So the enhancement stacking is like that. Or having like a little core ability that says, because you're this ultra powerful thing, regardless of where you're getting the enhancement from, you get it stacks or something akin.
Right. I know that both of the Earthbane cycle games have things that specifically say enhancement that stacks. That's a specific phrase that's used to say, okay, this enhancement does stack up. And there's even a few abilities in all of the Ultra games so far that have something called hits before the roll, which means that this doesn't give you enhancement. It gives you a hit before you roll the dice, which means that you're going to succeed, right?
Yeah.
Unless it's a super difficult thing, you're going to succeed. But again, like, so by adjusting all these numbers, saying, oh, I get 1 hit before the roll, knowing that's huge, whereas before that would have been largely indistinguishable from enhancement.
It's interesting to see how all that stuff changes, because before we didn't really have those hits before the roll happens.
Right, it wasn't even a concept.
Yeah, and then additionally we have the bonus dice. I feel like got removed with Storypath initially, or at least was a lot less big. Like I think the biggest dice pool you could get was like 13 dice typically, and now it seems like that's still present, but incorporated into the injury mechanic that you guys have, where you're adding dice as you get more and more injured.
Right, because so obviously early on with Storypath, we were still kind of, if I could term, muscle memory designing from storytelling systems, right? And the point of enhancements initially was to replace adding dice, because dice are very swingy. It's like, oh, I add 6 dice, but they all roll 5s. Great. So that was worthless. So enhancement, or a way to kind of mimic that without actually adding more dice, so you don't have to have buckets of dice. But people still added dice here and there, and so by pulling back on it, you're right, we're able to kind of slowly weed that back out. And with Ultra, by moving into injuries, the way Danielle and I talked about it, is that because that's a pretty common thing you're going to hit, and because it's an injury, it's an uncertain state in your body, having those be swingy feels good, because it's you're getting extra dice, but they may not always give you benefit because you're getting injured, you're wearing down. So every once in a while you get a quick pop of help, but it's not a persistent level of help as something like a good tool or a power does. So it's okay if those are swingy, whereas before, adding dice in, which is kind of, I don't know, add some more dice that feels like it should make it more powerful, right?
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, we joke, but genuinely a fair amount of design is just, does this feel right?
Mhm.
That's something that we actually do talk about to a degree in the core manual, is that game design is just as much art as science.
Mhm.
And that's a aspect that a lot of people don't seem to get, is that sometimes I can give you all the rules in the world to make a power, but sometimes the answer is, it just feels like it needs one more dot, or maybe I just need to kind of adjust this number. And that's a lot of what we do sometimes, is we're just like, that number looks right. And then we play test it. It's like, yeah, that number feels right. Being a little more open to saying, yeah, no, we do recognize that some of this is just vibes, but now that we have this consistent system that we very carefully built, we can say, okay, these are the areas where we could be vibes based. This is
Mhm.
the area of the system where we do it, but these core assumptions are no longer a place where we can muddle around. So
It's good. And you had mentioned that you had been working with Danielle on making these
mhm.
decisions. So how many designers have been working on the core of Storypath Ultra? Because I know you, Danielle, and Matthew have sort of been the leads on the Storypath Ultra products, and so there. What's the collaboration process look like?
So basically, how it works is, well, so officially, Danielle is the design lead on Storypath Ultra.
Mm.
We specifically hired her to update Storypath to the Ultra system. We had very specific design goals we wanted, and then Rich Rich is fantastic and has very good eye on a lot of things, but he recognizes that deep game design is not one of his strengths. So he basically just said, "You and Danielle sort it out. Come back to me with something, and I'll let you know what my thoughts are." So she and I kind of talked through a lot of things, and I head checked her, whatnot. But ultimately, she made those calls because my role on the team is kind of to act as the overall kind of producer of the StoryPath system. I was the person to make sure we were relatively consistent across StoryPath games when we were doing those, and so I kind of moved that role into Ultra. So Danielle's the design half, I'm the producer half, and then Matthew was the World Below is basically the first game we decided to do it on. So as a result of that, Matthew ended up talking closely with us about, I want to do this. We should probably go that way and whatnot. And then that over time developed into a three-person team where we do tend to run a lot of these ultra decisions by each other. So it's not like there's a pyramid or a authority structure necessarily, but if for some reason we are just knives out, one of us to make a decision, none of us are backing down,
Mhm.
Danielle gets to make the final call as the lead. I get to make the final call in terms of how the products roll out Ultra.
Mhm.
But it hasn't really come to that. It just, Matthew has an idea. And says, oh, that's really good. And there's been times where we've had phone calls where it's like, let's spend half an hour talking about how we're going to name this status effect because we have strong opinions. Should it be a flame? Should it be on fire? Should it be, whatever? We have those kinds of conversations. But there is an official structure, but at the end of the day, really, it's the three of us are kind of all pitching in and kicking around the tires on it.
Is so with the World Below being one of the first products using Storypath Ultra, when that gets released, is that going to be the first book out with the Storypath Ultra rules in it, or are we seeing the? Is it possible that like the core manual is going to come out before the other games?
Um, Given the nature of how these things come out, I never want to say this thing's definitely come up for that thing, just because um, as a random example, I worked on Realms of Pugmire, the core rulebook, like a year before I worked on Threats and Curse. But for a variety of reasons, Threats and Curse is going to be actually be coming out first before the core rulebook, and it's something we're actually playing with, and experimenting. Um, some projects just slip along faster than others, but in general, yes, you're probably going to see at least one, if not a couple, of Storypath Ultra based games come out before the core manual. Because if nothing else, once this campaign's done, I have to sit down and hire some writers and develop two whole new settings, integrate
Yeah.
those into the manual, and then start going through the editing process. Whereas the World Below is much further along in the production pipeline.
Mhm.
And there's right now, I'm knock on wood, not seeing any roadblocks to that coming out the door. So there's a pretty reasonable chance that that's going to come out first. But the again, because we're not requiring the core manual, it doesn't really matter which one comes out first. But it was important something that I was actually pretty adamant about at the start was making a couple of games with this before we did this,
Mhm.
because we learned a lot
Oh yeah.
making The World Below, and then we learned a whole lot again. And because it was Matthew making one game and Daniel making a second game and then me working on this game, we each saw different things. And there was stuff I was making right up to the launch of the core manual that I was saying, hey, Matthew, by the way, yet again, I need you to adjust a small thing in The World Below. And he was like, hey, I was working on The World Below and I realized we didn't do this. And so Danielle and I, so like there's a time where like, because Curseborne was in this mix too, so like all 4 games are having to be updated for a while.
Yeah.
And so like, but it was useful because each time we saw, oh, actually we could do this, or oh, hey, we should probably make a decision on this. Whereas if we had started with the core manual, put that out, then started making games with it, it would have been like, oh, we should have done this or should have done that, right? So this gave us a lot more flexibility, and also I feel makes the core manual stronger because I was able to better articulate, here's why we made these decisions, because we were literally making those decisions in other games.
I I get that a lot. Is there sort of like a requirements lock, to use a software term, in regards to the? Yeah. That's where my background is.
No,
Sorry.
totally. I've used some software terminology in this too.
But yeah.
I mean, like, in terms of like what you can and can't change.
Yeah, is there like, because you did, I think you mentioned that in the core rules there is like a section where it's like, these are the core rules that don't change across the
Right.
game
Yeah.
lines. Is there like a lock on that already or something like
Yes.
that?
There's actually at the end of, I want to say it's the first chapter. There's actually a sidebar I wrote in that's not really useful for people using the system to make their own games. So I was kind of open about that, as like going, if you want to keep it as accurate to Storypath Ultra as possible, here's decisions we made. But if you see other games based on Ultra, these are the decisions we make. And so there's a list of like the skill list won't change, the attributes won't change, how dice rolling works won't change, status effect names, power names, those will change, edge names might change, and the rules might adjust slightly. But generally speaking, if you see wealth in one, it's going to more or less work if it's called wealth again. But if it's called something else, all bets are off. And that was kind of the intentional goal. And then obviously with building block systems, crafting might be completely different between 2 games. And that's fine. To go back to terminology, there's certain things that are kind of hardwired. There's certain things that are permissions based, and certain things that are just bespoke programming.
Okay. Awesome. As someone I worked with Travis, one of the other Onyx Path freelancers, on a community project, like getting familiarized with like the underlying rules, like for instance, for a path, how many dots worth of edges or something you would have access to. Learning those, because they're not written in any book, as far as like seeing that sort of being incorporated into the Storypath Ultra Core Manual, or at least like being able to see how the under the hood, as it were, it seems like a really good thing to have for potential collaborators, freelancers, etc., who might not have seen the system yet.
No, totally. And I mean, hands up, that was actually a problem we had in Storypath, because as a random example, there are a lot of the early books where complication and difficulty are used more or less interchangeably. Because we weren't really articulating, not only to our writers, but also to our developers, who were then managing the writers, what the nuances were for all these things. And there are times where, like, people would just go off with, like, I don't know, 5 enhancement, 12 enhancement, I don't know what, and they're just making numbers up. And because nobody was on the same page, there wasn't a core document to pull from. A lot of things are happening. And that's actually where the initial discussions for Ultra came about, was because I was like, we need, for lack of a better term, a system reference document, an SRD, internally at least, to be able to kind of manage this. And then from there, discussion of, well, why don't we just adjust and update the system to make sure that it's the best we need it to be. And then, Ultra kind of came from all that. So, I mean, we're only now seeing the benefits of that, because Steam Wars is the first one that I'm able to say, here is the core manual manuscript. Use that for your basis. And we're just now starting to see, like, I'm still getting drafts in, so I don't know what's going to be like. But right now, writers seem a lot less confused right now.
That's good. That was speaking to the complication thing. That was something that always confused me as someone coming in from a different game to Storypath Core was in one game it would be like, okay, you have this complication, you take an injury if you don't buy off the complication, whereas like the a few lines down, maybe written by someone differently, it would be like, this complication means that you're sneaking and there's an additional complication, and if you don't buy off the complication, they notice you immediately. And I'm like, wait, that isn't that just failing the difficulty at that
Right.
point? What's
Right.
yeah. So
Absolutely. And conditions and field effects and all of that. Because we didn't have any kind of internal reference, what happened is that the Scion developers were slowly making very small decisions that steadily took Scion in one direction. The Trinity developers were steadily making decisions that took Trinity a different direction. So it wasn't even like the core rulebooks were radically different, although there were differences between the games. It was more just over time decisions because they were made in relative isolation
mhm,
that would slowly step that. But now, because we have a core document, if the Earthbane cycle needs to make decisions that slowly take it further and further away from Storypath, those decisions will be happening inside their building blocks, more or less,
mhm,
or their expansions of those rules. But the core rules are not going to be changing. We don't have to check every single book and compare it. That's the downside, right? We make so much.
mhm,
There's no way that one person can look at every single Trinity book, every single Scion book, every single Curseborne book, every single Earthbane book, every single Dystopia Rising book, and make sure they're all working the same. That's just not possible. So say, okay, let's compartmentalize the design decisions that are needed for those games into very specific areas that we can then, like I said, pop off,
mhm,
and they can go all the way on that road. And it doesn't hurt anybody. It doesn't change anything because those core rules are going to stay identical, and
mhm.
also means that there's a much smaller set of rules that we can. Okay, this is being used. We can say you're using this consistently because this one document, the core rules, says you have to use it this way.
Mhm. Is there anything that you've seen in the discussions online about Storypath Ultra, like that customer, like misconceptions that customers might have that you wish to clarify on in regards to the core manual?
So many, um, uh, but uh, honestly, I think the biggest one, because there's a lot of little things that people are like, I don't understand why this works this way. And what I've noticed over time, when either we explain or people have been seeing core manual, they go, oh, now I get it, right? So like, a lot of it, the really big exception is these rules don't work in isolation. Ultimately, the core rules are an engine that feeds into itself. It's not completely integrated. They're like the bond system is kind of in its own space, but the bond system is still built off the core rules, and bond systems work the same way. So, at a very extremely reductive level, things like bonds are identical to combat maneuvers.
Mhm,
That's one of the reasons why integrity and defense work the same, is because they're basically, I want something somebody else doesn't want to do. I want something to them. I have to roll against a certain number to make that happen to them.
mhm,
That's the core system. So, and also there are other things like that. People have a strong opinion, like, well, this doesn't seem to emulate blah genre well. It sure as heck does. It just doesn't work in a way that ultimately you want it to. The one thing that Storypath does really well, that granted, if you cannot get on board with this assumption, Storypath will not work well for you, is that we assume that all the player characters are competent and are
mhm,
generally good at what they do. That doesn't mean they're going to succeed all the time, but they're going to succeed a little bit more than average because we want people to feel like they're doing well. And when they fail, they're going to fail in ways that ultimately allow them to succeed later. If you're not on board with that premise, then yes, Storypath is not going to work for you, and it's not going to emulate whatever you want it to do well. But as we're hoping will show, it could do horror, it could do fantasy, it could do sci-fi, it could do superheroes, it could do godlike stuff. It's not just about emulating cool, powerful people. It can emulate people at a lower level. As a thought exercise, when I was developing it, because I wanted to prove this out,
mhm.
I had been reading the novels that the show Slow Horses are based off of, right?
Okay.
Those of you who don't know, Slow Horses is basically about a bunch of fuck up spies. They're the spies that MI6 cannot legally, or MI5 cannot legally fire. So they put them into a building where basically they could hopefully minimize the damage they will do. And the whole tone of the show slash novels is these people with no resources, no one cares about, having to make terrible decisions and still try to pull something good out of it. But they do generally succeed. right? Because they're protagonists.
Yeah.
But sometimes they die. Sometimes they make things worse. And in Storypath, it's very simple. Every single roll, if at all possible, comes with some kind of complication, just all the time. You open a door, there's a complication, that door's going to fall off in your hands. You walk across the street, it's a complication, a bus might actually clip you. Something is always going to kind of go wrong, which means that you're always having to push a little bit harder just to break even, just to not have bad things happen. And so you can do that kind of downtrodden, everything's rough story extremely easily in Storypath. So yeah, I think a big thing is that people are like, oh, it basically only does superpowers. No, it can do gritty, dark stuff where people are constantly struggling. It's extremely easy to do. It's just you have to look at the system and go, what is this actually doing, and how do I make it happen?
Yeah. I just from seeing Storypath Ultra initially, one of the big things I thought of, because you had changed the injury mechanic from being penalties to being the dice bonuses, and all I could think of was, if I reverse that, I go from having a sort of like a more like, oh, the adrenaline is pumping, to that sort of survival mechanic aspect. So if I did that, I could make something akin to, say, the that video game Grounded, where you're trying to survive your backyard as a shrunken person or something like that, and things like of that nature.
Yeah, and like, I mean, even though the injury mechanics are great, it's like, yes, if the more you get injured, you actually get bonuses to your path skills, and nothing else technically goes wrong. But we shift a lot of that into status effects, right? So like, to go back to something like slow horses, if you're beaten up, it's like, yeah, I'm getting bonuses to my investigation skills and my persuasion skills to become a spy, but also I might have the agony status effect where I get penalties for that. I might be bleeding, which gives penalties for that. That's where the grittiness comes in. It's not about just number go down. That's because that's a design spiral, right? It's the by every time I get injured, my desk gets worse, which means I get injured more, which means ultimately I die. That we're trying to avoid that. We're trying to flatten that curve. So by adding more dice, we flatten the curve. But if you want to replicate that, just use status effects, and you can get the exact same effect.
That's a I didn't even think about thinking in that way. That's a good way of doing it. I like the I've only used status effects quite sparingly because I'm not sure when some of them get activated. But I can see that now. It's like, oh, you give someone the aggravated wounds status effect for like being in this one area or something. It can, like, you're in like a radioactive lab or something, and it's like, now, like, things of that nature.
Another concern I've heard is like, people are like, oh, so a gun that punches the same thing. It's like, yeah, but if the gun does the aggravated wound damage, you're going to take it out by one shot. That feels like a gunshot to me.
Oh yeah, God, that's definitely Call of Cthulhu levels of, oh no.
Yeah, right. But the thing is that Storypath Ultra does it out of the box. It doesn't require you to change anything. It requires you to use the tools that are there in a different configuration.
Exactly. And so a question I've seen other people ask online in regards to the support around the game. What sort of virtual tabletop support is there going to be with Storypath Ultra, or what are you looking into?
I don't want to say too much because these things have an unfortunate habit of falling apart on us. But we are talking with a partner about possibly doing some kind of VTT support. And again, because we now have a cohesive underpinning, one of the many benefits we have for having something Storypath Ultra is we could say, build us a compendium using Storypath Ultra as a base, and then we can make the changes on top of that, rather than before we more or less had to build a Trinity or a Scion or whatever base separately. And so the hope is that this will allow us to actually long-term make more VTT support. But as I've said before a few times, we don't have that knowledge in-house. So we have to rely on partners to do that. And so we're at the mercy of what they can do, when they'll do it. And of course, if the finances make sense, because, I mean, we are still a pretty small company. And so we can't throw, Wizards of the Coast money at software solutions. So,
as far as like a little, like, something that you guys have done with, from what I've seen from the first manuscript preview, I really just want to thank you for the VTT squares for the ranges, because I've I used to love using maps because I grew out of the 4E D&D 4E like
Hmm.
mindset where they
I
use
love
squares
4E.
a lot. Yeah. And when I moved to Storypath Ultra, it was always confusing for me how to, or not Storypath Ultra, Storypath Core.
Hmm.
I always was a little bit confused with what do the ranges mean, and so I
Right.
like ranges I had to like throw out if I used a map because I would be like I don't know what's one square versus two squares versus like 5 or 10 or something of that
And I
nature.
will say it's funny because like when we first designed Story Path,
Yeah.
um, the core assumption was everyone would play around the table because that is the core assumption of a lot of tabletop design up to 2020.
Yeah.
We started talking about Ultra during the pandemic. And so one of the things that, well, one of the things I went to Danielle and talked to her about was like, we need to make sure this has no baked in people are playing around the table assumptions.
Mhm.
And so that was one of the things we, talked about. It's like we have to have squares. And that was a pretty easy fix. But yeah, I'm glad you appreciate that because that was exactly something I want to do is like, I want to make sure there's not a rule in here. Even some of the language I try to be careful about, like, when we try to say like around the table or whatnot, when we try to give advice, we try to make sure that there's some form of if you're playing online, here are these other options, and make sure that again, like the rolling dice again. That's actually one of the things reasons for that was because of BTT. It's easier to program it just 10 equals 2 hits rather than roll a 10 again, roll a 10 again, roll a 10. So some of that was also just it's easier to emulate that online than it is to emulate in person.
I get that entirely. So we're getting down to, as far as my interview questions go, down to the last bit of like, is there anything you'd like to say about Storypath Ultra before we delve more into your background?
Honestly, I think it's just I'm super excited about it, and I will say that we have absolutely been listening to feedback. As a random example, there was some discussion around investigations relatively recently that uh, while the proposed solution was not what made sense, it did point out that hey, there actually is a flaw here in terms of how we do leads, for example. And so we were able to adjust that right before the crowdfunding to make sure that that made more sense. There's other like things that as people have gone, hey, this doesn't make sense. Even if it's the no, we're not going to change that, it has at least in the manual prompted me to do things. Okay, let me add a sidebar here to explain that, because one thing that I hope this book will do is it will never be perfect. There will always be things that people don't understand or don't make sense to them or they'll want to adjust. But my hope is that by revealing not only how it all works together, but also why and our assumptions are. Even if people say, I don't want to do that, they know now why it's not working the way they want it to. And encourages them to say, okay, now that I know how it works, I do want to change it. And I know I can go in this direction and adjust it. Because I very rarely, unless I'm running it for professionally, I rarely run games as written in my home games. So I think any game that says you must run it this way is just silly because that's not how it's going to be run. So instead, being able to say, no, we expect you to change it, but we think now we have a good way that makes it easier and clearer how to make those changes. So you don't have to be a game designer to make some add the table decisions.
Let's delve a little bit into your background now. So, how did you get started with Onyx Path Publishing?
Super short version is that I was a full-time freelancer. I was a part-time freelancer until 2007, where Rich Thomas, who was then working at White Wolf, told me that there was going to be a merger with CCP and asked me if I wanted to come as a full-time employee there. So I worked at White Wolf CCP until 2014. 2012, Rich went off to form Onyx Path Publishing, and at the time that I was working at CCP, no one else kind of really knew what tabletop role-playing games were or how they worked. So I kind of fell into the role of being the liaison between Rich and the rest of the company. So he was then my boss at CCP. So it's like, okay, yeah, very natural relationship. We just kind of kept working more or less in that vein. And then when I was laid off in 2014, I went to Rich for other kind of freelance work, which I've been doing on the side, built that up a bit more. And then in 2017, we turned that into a full-time freelance assignment. I'm still a freelancer, so I can pick and choose wherever I want to, but I'm on a regular monthly contract with Onyx Path Publishing. So really, I've been working with Rich in some form or capacity for, doing math in my head, 15, almost 20 years. So yeah, been a long time.
It's crazy. It's crazy, and I didn't know, and I apologize a little bit for this because I guess not many people know the people who are actually creating the games in the background. But
Mhm.
I heard your name when I was in, I think it was either after college or during college, in regards to the extra credits like videos online where
Oh wow, okay.
you were talking about game design theory and stuff
Uh-huh.
like that. How did that come about? How did you start working on like the online game design video
Uh,
things?
Hilariously, it was by chance. When I was living in Atlanta, I went to Atlanta for a while. I had a pretty strong video game uh, infrastructure. There's a lot of video game companies working there, much less now. But at the
Yeah.
time, and I think they still do it, but they had a yearly Atlanta convention. It was just for Atlanta game companies. Other people can come in, but it was based in Atlanta.
Mhm.
And I happened to run into James Portnow there, and we got talking about tabletop games, and he got really excited about it. And he did a kind of a little presentation where we would play through. He would play through a video game, and we would talk through kind of the game decisions that went for good or bad in this. It was the aborted prototype of one of the Silent Hill games, and so we were playing through and like, this is why this is a good decision, bad decision. And afterwards, he's like, "Would you want to write for extra credits?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure," because they were thinking about expanding into physical games.
Mhm.
And so James Portnow then kind of after one or two episodes, he kind of went on his own thing.
Mhm.
But I became friends with the rest of the team, and so over time, I kind of just fell into being their, for lack of a better term, the tabletop RPG correspondent, right? So every time it's like, "Hey Eddie, what the hell's going on with Wizards of the Coast and D&D in 2023?" And I'm like, "Oh boy, let me tell you." And it's like, let's write a half-hour episode about this. Like, what? Okay. Um, but I mean, a lot of times it's just like, hey, pitch us something that might be cool. And so it's like, you know what? I really have strong opinions about character sheets, or I really have strong opinions about how classes are made. And they're like, yeah, cool. Let's see if that makes sense for a 7-minute video. And some of the stuff I pitched, they weren't keen on. But generally speaking, I usually pitch them two or three things, and they pick one, and we go with that. So I've now done, let's see, 16, 17 scripts with them. I just finished up one recently about Monopoly, actually.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, it's been fun, and I really enjoy working for them when we can make it work.
That Monopoly video really blew my mind. I didn't realize the whole history of it.
Oh
Like I
yeah,
knew to an extent, but I didn't realize how deep the rabbit hole went.
yeah, no, and it was funny because a couple of years ago, we went to Gen Con. I know I think about a couple of years ago. Geez, that's really 2019. Wow, that's how long it's been.
Yeah.
Um, right before the pandemic, I met up with them at Gen Con, and they had just done a whole bunch of Magic videos. So, let's go join a Magic tournament. And so three of us went to go to a Magic tournament. And the only reason why we were not in last is because the team below us left the tournament. So we are second to last because we stuck it out. Otherwise, we were rubbish. It was
this
great.
this is where you find out that game developers or designers don't have an inherent uh, advantage over others when playing.
I can tell you why the Magic design system works the way it does. Doesn't mean I can take advantage of it in a meaningful way.
Now, you guys all talk like Onyx Path, the Onyx Path cast that you do with Dixie Cocker and Danielle and Matthew.
Mhm.
All you guys are. It's so much more than just like Onyx Path's podcast. It's also like a huge game design. Like just hearing game designers talk about the everything under the hood, like kicking tires and things like that,
Mhm.
doing the everything around there. I wanted to ask a little bit more in particular for you. What would you say is one of the biggest lessons you've learned as a game designer?
Oh, geez. Uh, Honestly, I think uh, less is more is really the biggest one. 'Cause this is advice I tend to give to a lot of newer game designers myself. It is a very natural instinct to say, I see a problem with my game. Let me write a rule to solve it. Uh, and sometimes the answer is you actually just take a rule away,
Hmm.
or even a whole chunk of rules. So there are lots of times when I'm designing games where I'll write a bunch of rules, and then throughout time, I start pulling some back and pulling some back and pulling some back, until it gets just the ones that I need to. And not every game lends itself to this design, but certainly with Ultra is actually a good example. Storypath had built up kind of a barnacle of edge case rules to try to solve problems. And it's okay, let's actually just take all that stuff out and replace it with one rule that solves all of these.
Mhm.
But particularly with tabletop RPGs, by leaving more chances for the people at the table to make their own decisions. It's not a style of play that everyone likes. So you can't go too far with it. You can't go like OSR, where it's like, there's no rules, make it all up, just roll d20 and figure out what numbers are. And it can't go quite that far, but not having to account for every single edge case and go, is this edge case actually a regular occurring damaging problem? No, leave it alone. And sometimes if it's all of these rules don't seem to quite work, well, just take them out and see what happens.
Awesome. I just realized there was one question I had thought of that I didn't put in here, or maybe it was like early on. A secret question. It was a question I had earlier on in here where I wanted to ask a little bit more about the thing about, like, so the community content update, the community content expedition that you had for as a crowd goal for Storypath Ultra is the reason. So why is the reason that it seems like it takes such a long time for community content, or maybe even like an open gaming license or something? Not that you guys have talked about that. It takes so long for that to occur. Is it like all about talking with lawyers and things like that? Is it like a background thing of just making sure you guys have crossed your T's and dotted your I's? Like,
it's actually not a legal thing, because mostly drive-through RPG handles a lot of the legalese. We do have conversations with our reps there to kind of make sure that we're getting the things we want to get across. No, I think the biggest reason why it seems like it takes a long time is we wait until the core rulebook is out in print before we open it up. And so it's like, oh my God, it's been 2 years. Like, yes, but the book has been out for a week, right? So it feels like it's been a long time, but actually we don't want people making community content because the whole goal of community content is to sell our books. So if they're selling community content, but we're not selling our book, then that's not what we're getting out of it. Our goal is to primarily to encourage the community, obviously, but the goal should be, oh, that adventure looks cool, I need to buy this book to get it. So click, 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 I bought them, they're in my cart now. That's the metric we want to get going. So with something like this, it's like we can kind of expedite core manual, just because by definition, any kind of community content needs to have the core manual to work from it. So it has to be out before then, but we could ideally, because it's just a system, there's less we have to worry about. We have to worry about, okay, what are the aesthetics we have to keep track of, what are things, topics we don't want to cover, because that's the other pieces. We don't want people making me content that ultimately is something that we want to make ourselves. But with the core system, lots of goes out the window. So it is slightly easier to expedite that now that we got that stretch goal. But no, really a lot of it is just waiting for the actual book to get out and deciding what we want to allow people to do and not allow people to do. And over time, we've gotten better and better about that. But like to use Canis Minor, my Pugmire program as an example, I did kind of put the brakes on it for a bit because I knew second edition was coming, right? And I had to figure out, how does first edition fit into that? I mean, I knew I still wanted to let people make that stuff because in the day, first edition not going anywhere. But I had to make sure that wasn't bleeding into what I want to do for a second edition. And also, to be honest, sometimes it's just a case of we have a lot of other stuff going on, right? So it's like, I have so many hours a day. Do I use it to make a good game, or do I do it to figure out the nuances of this community content program? Sometimes the answer is the game. And I know something that and actually several people in the company have said, like, we need to also talk about community content, but we got a lot going on. So sometimes it's just we lose track of it, but most of the time it feels that way because we have to wait for the book to get out.
That's fair. And so we're at time now. What projects are you currently working on, and where can people find you?
Okay, so what I'm working on right now is obviously with Onyx Path, working on a lot of stuff. The short list is I'm working on another Realms of Pugmire book, tentatively called Expansion of the Realms. It'll be the biggest Pugmire book I've ever worked on. So look forward to that. Yes, badges are in it. Enjoy that. I'm working with Matthew on Steam Wars, which is the next Trinity Continuum game, first one based on Storypath Ultra. Yes, all the rules are going to be in Steam Wars. You do not need the Trinity Core Rulebook to play that. We're also working on Curseborne, I'm sure you've heard of it, whatever. We're also working on Monster Kingdoms. Matthew and I are working together on Monster Kingdoms, which is the third Earthbane cycle game. That one's just still an outline phase. And on top of all of that, I'm also working on other projects, including just announced, I'm working on the new Night City source book for Cyberpunk Red. And somewhere in there, I think I have a Patreon, although I may have to shut that down. I've got, interviews like this going on. So I got a lot, man.
so where can people find you and hear more about the stuff you're doing?
You can find me hyperventilating in the corner in a paper bag. But when I'm not doing that, you can find me. Pugsteady is what I go by professionally. That's my website, PUGSTADY, pugsteady.com. That's also where you can find me on Blue Sky, or you can find me on the Onyx Path Discord. It is a joke, but it's also kind of true that if you post a Transformers email, I'll probably show up within 20 minutes. Unless I'm asleep. Then you have 20 minutes after I get up.
Awesome. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate what you and everyone at Onyx Path have been doing. Check out the Storypath Ultra backer kit currently live. Back it up now, where we just hit another stretch goal, and hopefully it'll hit the next stretch goal soon. So
yes, look forward to that.
Looking forward to that. Bye.
Bye.